My name is on the deed. My father's name is on the dam. Neither one mattered to her. She called it an eyesore. She called it $50,000. I paid nothing. 3 months later, the county sent me a letter that changed everything. My father hadn't built a pond. He'd built a warning system. I didn't understand that until the night the sirens went off. By then, she'd already dug her own grave 6 feet under her guest wing. And I was the only one who knew it was coming. I'm Callie Reyes, 34, and I grew up in the last house on Larkspur Hollow. The one with the low stone wall and the little pond behind it that my father built with his own hands the summer I turned 9. He was a civil engineer for the county before he retired. The kind of man who read topographic maps for fun. And when he died 2 years ago, he left me the house, the land, and a dam he swore would matter more than anyone realized. Willow Creek Estates was the kind of neighborhood that looked perfect in a real estate brochure. Matching mailboxes, trimmed hedges, a welcome sign with cursive lettering, and for the first year after I moved back in, felt like exactly the fresh start I needed. The HOA president was a woman named Deborah Voss. 62. Silver bob. Cardigans buttoned to the throat. And a laugh that sounded rehearsed. Everyone called her Debbie to her face and something else behind her back. Deborah ran 3 committees, chaired the board, and had outlasted for presidents before her by simply never losing an election nobody else wanted to enter. She treated the HOA newsletter like scripture and the covenant book like a weapon. I'd met her exactly twice before the fine, once at my father's memorial, where she complimented the flowers and asked if I planned to modernize the property, and once in the mailroom, where she looked at my mud boots like they'd personally offended her. Neighbors warned me early. Frank Delgado, 2 doors down, told me over the fence that Deborah had once fined a widow $400 for a non-compliant wind chime. I laughed it off. The pond itself was small, maybe 30 feet across, held back by a low fieldstone dam my father had reinforced with a modern spillway system he'd designed himself, tucked behind a stand of oaks at the low corner of our lot, where the land dropped toward the creek. He used to say the whole neighborhood sat in a bowl, and that Larkspur Hollow was the drain. I thought it was just something engineers said. I didn't ask what he meant. The first real sign of trouble came in a beige envelope with the HOA's gold foil seal. Sitting in my mailbox between a pizza coupon and a water bill, looking harmless until I opened it. Inside was a single sheet, notice of aesthetic violation, unauthorized water feature. It cited a covenant clause I'd never heard of and gave me 30 days to remediate the offending structure. I read it twice, laughed once, and called the HOA office, certain it was a clerical mistake. The woman who answered simply said, "You'll want to speak with Deborah directly," in a tone that told me this wasn't the first time she'd said it. I found Deborah at the community garden, pruning roses she didn't own with shears she probably did. She smiled when she saw me, the kind of smile that never touches the eyes. "I was hoping you'd stop by," she said, like she'd been expecting me. "There's nothing wrong with my dad's pond," I told her. "It's been there 15 years. Nobody's complained." She tilted her head. "Someone has now," she said, and wouldn't tell me who. I should have pressed harder. I didn't know yet how much that would cost me. She explained, sweetly, that the covenant had been clarified at a board meeting I hadn't attended, One where unpermitted water features altering natural drainage were newly classified as violations. I asked when that meeting happened. She said, "Does it matter?" I said yes. She changed the subject. I left the garden with my jaw tight and my mind already drafting an appeal. I didn't yet understand that Deborah Voss had never lost an appeal in 11 years, because she was the one who decided which appeals got heard. That night I called my father's old friend, a county drainage engineer named Sal, and asked him, half joking, whether a decorative backyard pond could really be a violation. He didn't laugh. "Depends whose pond it is," he said, "and what it's actually doing." The appeal hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday in the clubhouse. Folding chairs arranged in a horseshoe like a courtroom built out of a church basement. Deborah at the head table flanked by 2 board members who spent the entire meeting looking at their phones. I brought photos of the pond, a printed copy of my father's original county permit, and a binder of neighbors who'd told me privately they didn't mind it. Deborah barely glanced at the permit. "That's outdated documentation," she said. "The covenant supersedes county permitting." I told her a county permit doesn't expire because an HOA decides it's inconvenient. She smiled again. "Or we can discuss your fine," she said, and the board members nodded like she'd said something profound instead of something absurd. One of the silent board members, a younger man named Trent, finally spoke up to ask if anyone had actually inspected the pond. Deborah answered before I could. The aesthetics committee submitted a full report. I asked to see it. She said it wasn't required to be shared at this stage. The vote was 3-0 to uphold the fine, with Trent abstaining and looking distinctly uncomfortable. $50,000, due in 90 days, or the HOA would pursue remediation by contractor and bill me for the demolition on top of the penalty. I walked out of that clubhouse shaking, not from fear but from the particular fury of being railroaded by someone smiling the entire time. In the parking lot, Frank was waiting by my car like he'd known exactly how it would go. "Told you," he said quietly. "She did this to the Hendersons 2 years back. Fined them for a shed that was up before she even moved in. They caved and sold within 6 months. I asked who bought the house. He looked at me for a long moment. "Guess," he said. That night I sat at my father's old desk going through his files, looking for anything that might help, and found a manila folder labeled drainage, Larkspur in his careful engineer's block lettering, untouched since he'd filed it years ago. Inside were topographic surveys, a letter from the County Drainage Authority, and a diagram showing the entire cul-de-sac as a shallow basin, with an arrow pointing straight through my backyard labeled outlet. "Do not obstruct" in red ink, underlined twice. I didn't fully understand the engineering yet, but I understood the words "do not obstruct" well enough to know that whatever this dam was doing, it wasn't decoration, and whoever wanted it gone hadn't bothered to ask why it was there in the first place. I hired a lawyer named Priya Anand the next morning, a sharp, no-nonsense woman who specialized in HOA disputes and had, in her words, seen every flavor of small kingdom tyranny homeowners associations have to offer. She read the notice and the covenant clause twice before she even sat down. "This clause was added 8 months ago," she said, cross-referencing the covenant's revision date against the county recorder's office. Which means either they held a proper amendment vote with quorum, or they didn't, and if they didn't, this whole violation is built on nothing. She filed a records request for the meeting minutes, the amendment vote tally, and the mysterious Aesthetics Committee report Deborah had refused to produce. The HOA had 30 days to respond. Deborah, turned out, had other plans for those 30 days. 2 weeks later, a truck marked Voss and coal development idled outside my house for nearly 20 minutes before driving off. I didn't think much of it at the time. I wrote the name down anyway, mostly out of habit. That habit would matter more than I knew. My neighbor Marisol, who worked at the county clerk's office, mentioned offhand at a block barbecue that Voss and Cole had filed 3 development proposals near Larkspur Hollow in the past year, all quietly withdrawn before reaching a public hearing. I asked why. Money talks. Usually. I started paying closer attention after that, to the trucks, to the names, to how often Deborah mentioned future value and neighborhood potential in conversations that had nothing to do with either. It felt like static behind a signal I couldn't quite tune in yet. Priya's records request came back heavily redacted, with entire pages blacked out under a claim of attorney-client privilege for a homeowners association that, as far as I could tell, had never previously hired an attorney for anything smaller than a lawsuit. Somebody's protecting something, Priya said, tapping the redacted pages. Ordinary HOA business doesn't need privilege. This is the language people use when they're hiding a decision, not defending one. I believed her. I still didn't know what the decision was. The fine deadline crept closer while the records fight dragged through appeals of its own. And Deborah escalated in smaller, meaner ways, a notice for my mailbox paint color, one for grass height, one for a garden gnome she claimed violated seasonal display guidelines that didn't exist in writing anywhere. Each notice was $30 to $80. Small enough that fighting them individually cost more in time than money, which I later realized was exactly the point. Death by 1,000 paper cuts, delivered in beige envelopes with gold foil seals. I started a folder of my own, mirroring my father's, every notice, every date, every inconsistency between what the covenant actually said and what Deborah claimed it said. Priya called it building a pattern. I called it evidence of a woman who couldn't stand not being obeyed. At the next open board meeting, I stood up during public comment and asked, calmly, why the Aesthetics Committee report on my pond had never been produced despite 2 formal requests. Deborah said the committee chair was unavailable to discuss it. I asked who the chair was. She said, "That's not relevant." A woman near the back, older, silver-haired like Deborah but with kinder eyes, muttered just loud enough for me to hear, "There is no committee, honey. There's just her." Deborah's head snapped toward the sound so fast her earring nearly came loose. After the meeting, I found the woman in the parking lot before she could disappear into her car. Her name was Ruth, a founding resident of Larkspur Hollow, one of the original owners from before the HOA even had a logo. "She's done this before," Ruth told me. "Ask about the Petersons." I hadn't heard the name Peterson before. Ruth said they'd owned my father's lot's twin, the identical corner property 1 street over, until a structural violation forced a sale 8 years ago. Coal Development bought it within a month, Ruth said. Paid cash. That was the second time I'd heard the name Coal in a week, and this time it didn't feel like a coincidence. I thanked Ruth and drove home with my hands tight on the wheel, replaying every conversation I'd had with Deborah since the memorial service. I told Priya everything Ruth had said. She went quiet for a moment, then said the words that would end up defining the next 4 months of my life. Callie, I think this was never about the pond. I think the pond is just in the way of something bigger. Priya widened the record's request to include any HOA correspondence involving the name coal or Voss and coal development over the past 3 years, citing the association's own disclosure bylaws. The board had 15 business days to respond or face a formal complaint to the state's HOA oversight office. Deborah must have heard about the new request within hours, because that same evening a contractor's van appeared outside my house. No HOA authorization, no notice, and 2 men started unloading equipment near my backyard fence before I even made it out the front door. I confronted them in the driveway, heart pounding, and learned they'd been hired directly by the association to begin preliminary assessment of my unauthorized structure, a full month before my appeal process had even legally concluded. I ordered them off my property and called Priya from the porch. Shaking, Priya fired off an emergency cease and desist within the hour, citing the association's own bylaws requiring a homeowner's written consent for any contractor access. The men left, and confronted at the next meeting, claimed it was a scheduling miscommunication. Nobody believed her, and for the first time, I could see it on their faces. Something shifted in the neighborhood after that. Quiet conversations at mailboxes, a few more people meeting my eyes at the grocery store, Marisol slipping me a printed copy of a county zoning map she happened to have handy. People were starting to watch Deborah the way she'd always watched everyone else. Frank told me, almost apologetically, that he'd kept his mouth shut for years because he was scared of exactly what was happening to me now. Fines, contractors, pressure. You're the first one who fought back instead of folding, he said. People are paying attention because of that. I didn't feel brave, and increasingly certain that whatever Deborah was protecting was worth far more to her than $50,000. Or she wouldn't have risked sending unauthorized contractors onto my land before the ink on the fine was even dry. That week, I drove past the old Peterson house Ruth had mentioned, the twin lot 1 street over, and found it gone entirely, replaced by a half-finished luxury spec home with a Voss and coal development sign staked in the yard, glossy and confident, like it had always belonged there. I parked across the street and just looked at it for a long time. Same original lot shape as mine. Same low corner near the creek. Same drainage bowl my father's diagram had shown. Except here, there was no dam, no pond, no outlet, just a sprawling foundation poured straight into the low ground. A construction worker on a break told me, unprompted, that the site had flooded like crazy during framing the year before, delaying the project 3 months, until they brought in extra fill dirt and regrade the whole lot higher. I thanked him and drove home with a knot in my stomach. That night, I spread my father's old survey across the kitchen table again. This time really studying it, the arrow, the outlet, the words do not obstruct, and for the first time I understood he hadn't built a pretty pond behind our house. He'd built the only thing standing between the bowl and a flood. I called Sal, my father's old engineering friend, and read him the diagram over the phone. He was quiet for a long moment. Your dad built that outlet after the '09 storm, he finally said. Half the cul-de-sac took on water. He designed it so it never happened again. He never told the HOA the real reason. Said they'd improve it into uselessness. Improve it how? I asked. Sal sighed. Build on it. Ground is just ground. Until it isn't. I thought of the Peterson lot. Regraded and built over. And felt something cold settle behind my ribs. I asked Sal if he'd testify to any of this if it came to that. He hesitated. Callie, I don't want trouble, he said. Then added, almost as an afterthought, but I kept copies of everything your dad filed with the county. Just in case. I asked what he meant by just in case. He was quiet again. Longer this time. Your dad wasn't the trusting type when it came to that HOA, he said. He used to say someone on that board would try to undo his work eventually. I guess he wasn't wrong. I began driving the neighborhood at odd hours after that, mapping the drainage bowl in my head, noting which lots sat low, which sat high, and which ones, like Deborah's own sprawling property at the end of Larkspur Court, had quietly expanded over the years with additions that hugged the lowest, wettest ground. Deborah's house, I realized one evening, backed directly onto the same natural floodplain buffer my father's outlet was designed to protect, except her property had, at some point, grown a guest wing that extended well past where the original buffer line should have been. I mentioned it to Priya, who immediately requested the building permits for Deborah's guest wing addition through the county's public portal. The results came back oddly, conveniently thin, a single permit, issued 9 years ago, for minor residential renovation, with no engineering review attached at all. Additions into a floodplain buffer normally require a hydrology study, Priya explained. This permit has none. Either the county missed it completely, or somebody made sure it got approved without one. I asked who signs off on those approvals. She looked it up. A county inspector named Gary Holt. A quick search told us Gary Holt had retired from the county 5 years ago, and now worked, according to his own public LinkedIn profile, as a compliance consultant for Voss and Coal Development. I stared at the screen for a long time before I said anything at all. So the inspector who approved her illegal floodplain addition now works for the company buying up devalued lots after she finds people out of their homes, I said slowly, watching Priya nod along with each word like she was confirming a math problem out loud. That's not proof of a crime yet, Priya cautioned. But it's a very strong reason to keep pulling this thread. I told her I wasn't planning on stopping. For the first time since the beige envelope arrived, the fear in my chest had started curdling into something closer to resolve. At the next HOA meeting, I sat in the front row instead of hiding near the back. And when public comment opened, I didn't mention my pond at all. I asked, simply, whether any board member had a financial relationship with Voss and Coal Development. The room went very quiet. Deborah's smile didn't waver, but her knuckles went white around her pen. That's an inappropriate question, she said. I'll allow the next speaker. Trent, the young board member, looked at me for a beat too long before looking down at the table. After the meeting, Trent caught up with me in the parking lot, glancing back at the clubhouse before he spoke. I abstained on your vote because something felt wrong, he said quietly. I didn't know what exactly. I think I'm starting to. I asked him directly if he knew anything about Deborah's ties to the development company. He hesitated, then admitted he'd once seen an email thread on the shared board account referencing the Reyes lot and post-fine acquisition timeline, but that Deborah had quickly claimed it was spam and deleted it herself. Deleted emails aren't actually gone, Priya said when I told her. already drafting a subpoena request for the HOA's email server backups as part of our ongoing dispute. If that thread exists anywhere, we'll find it. HOAs almost never think about backups until it's too late. The neighborhood, meanwhile, had started dividing quietly into two camps, those still intimidated into silence, and a growing handful, Frank and Ruth and Marisol among them, who'd begun comparing notes about every strange find, every convenience sale, every name that kept reappearing on development paperwork. Ruth told me she'd started keeping her own folder years ago, after the Petersons left, just in case anyone ever asked. She handed it to me at her kitchen table, newspaper clippings, old HOA newsletters, even a photo of the original Peterson dam, nearly identical to mine, bulldozed flat. They fined the Petersons for the exact same thing, Ruth said, tapping the photo. Unauthorized water feature. Aesthetic violation. Same language as your notice. It wasn't a coincidence anymore. It was a pattern with my name written at the bottom of it. I brought Ruth's folder to Priya, who cross-referenced the Peterson case with public county sale records and found the final piece that made her sit back in her chair. The Petersons' old lot had sold to Voss and Cole exactly 41 days after their forced dam removal. The same window written into my own fine notice. This isn't an HOA overreacting to a pond, Priya said. This is a documented pattern of manufactured violations timed to devalue specific lots ahead of acquisition. If we can prove Deborah personally benefits from Voss and Cole, this stops being a covenant dispute and becomes something much bigger. I asked her what much bigger meant exactly. She looked at me steadily. Fraud. Duty. Possibly conspiracy. If county officials were paid to look the other way. Callie, I think you might be sitting on more than a $50,000 fine. I think you're sitting on the reason your father built that dam in the first place. For a few weeks after that, things went strangely quiet. No new notices arrived. The contractor's van didn't return. Deborah, when I passed her at the mailboxes, offered only a tight nod instead of her usual rehearsed smile, like she'd finally clocked me as a problem rather than a formality. Priya warned me not to mistake the silence for surrender. People like her don't retreat, she said. They regroup. I wanted to believe the fight was cooling off. Some small, tired part of me even let myself hope Deborah had simply decided I wasn't worth the trouble anymore. I used the lull to reinforce the dam myself, hauling stone and resealing joints my father had built years ago, half out of stubbornness and half out of a growing, unshakable feeling that whatever came next, that outlet needed to be able to do exactly what it was designed for. Sal came by one Saturday to help, bringing an old toolbox that had belonged to my father, and together we spent the afternoon working in comfortable silence. The kind two people share when grief and purpose start to look like the same thing. He'd be glad you finally understand it, Sal said, packing up as the sun dropped low over the oaks. Most people just see a pond. He built a promise. I didn't fully understand what he meant by that yet. I would, before the summer was over. Marisol invited me to a smaller gathering at her house one evening, unofficial and unadvertised, where 6 or 7 neighbors traded stories over lemonade about notices, fines, and strange sudden sales they'd never quite understood until now. Ruth brought her folder. I brought mine, out of the Voss and Cole website. By the end of the night, We had a rough shared timeline stretching back nearly a decade. 5 separate properties fined for vague aesthetic or structural violations. All later sold. All eventually connected in some way to Voss and coal development. 5 families who'd left Larkspur Hollow believing it was simply bad luck. We should have compared notes years ago, Ruth said quietly, looking at the timeline spread across Marisol's dining table. We all just assumed it was our own bad luck. Nobody talks about losing their house. You just quietly leave and everyone else moves on. I told them what Priya had found about the Peterson sale, the 41-day window, the retired inspector now on Voss and Cole's payroll. The room went very still. Frank finally said what everyone seemed to be thinking. She's not just difficult. She's running a business off this HOA. We agreed, cautiously, to keep gathering documentation quietly rather than confronting Deborah directly again. At least until Priya's subpoena for the board's email backups came through. I left that night feeling something I hadn't felt since my father died. Like I wasn't the only one carrying this anymore. The quiet lasted exactly 17 days. Then Priya called me on a Thursday morning, her voice tighter than usual. The subpoena went through, she said. We got the email backups. Callie, you need to sit down before I read you what's in the Reyes Lot thread. The recovered emails, dated 4 months before my fine notice ever arrived, showed Deborah messaging a Voss and Cole project manager directly. Reyes Lot has the best drainage position on the block. Same profile as the Peterson parcel. Once the dam's gone, we can move fast. Same playbook. Same playbook. Every fine. Every stalled appeal. Every coincidental contractor visit into a single deliberate strategy with my name attached from the very beginning. Months before I'd ever heard the words aesthetic violation or seen a beige envelope with a gold foil seal. Priya said the emails alone weren't enough to win everything outright. Deborah's lawyers, once they eventually got involved, would call it aspirational language and internal brainstorming. But paired with the Peterson pattern and the inspector's employment history, it was no longer a theory. It was a case. We're not just fighting a fine anymore, Priya told me. We're building a fraud complaint with the state HOA oversight office, and possibly a referral to the county for permitting fraud. This is going to get loud. Callie, are you ready for that? It's the day my father's diagram said, do not obstruct. The next board meeting was standing room only. Word having spread quietly through the group chat Marisol had started. And Deborah must have sensed the shift in the room the moment she walked in, because her usual opening pleasantries evaporated into a clipped, businesslike agenda run-through. When public comment opened, I stood with a folder in my hand, not to bluff, just to steady my nerves and ask the board, on the record, whether any member had received compensation, consulting fees, or property benefits from Voss and Cole development in the past 5 years. Deborah's composure cracked for the first time I'd ever witnessed. I won't dignify baseless accusations, she snapped, her voice sharper than her usual honeyed tone, and for a moment the whole room seemed to lean forward, sensing the same thing I did. That wasn't a denial. It was a deflection. Trent, sitting at the board table, quietly slid a folder toward the association's designated recording secretary and said, evenly, for the record, I'd like these minutes to reflect that I requested a formal ethics review of Board President Voss's outside business relationships. Deborah's head turned toward him like he'd struck her. You have no standing to request that, she snapped. Trent didn't back down. Board member can request an ethics review with a seconding vote. He looked around the table. 2 hands went up, slow but certain. It was the first vote Deborah had lost in 11 years. The meeting dissolved into raised voices and side conversations. Deborah insisting the review was a coordinated smear, while Ruth, from the back row, called out loud enough for everyone to hear, "Ask her about the Petersons while you're at it." A murmur rippled through the crowd like a held breath finally released. Deborah adjourned the meeting early, gaveling it closed over the objections of at least 4 board members, and stormed out through the side door instead of the front, where a dozen neighbors were still lingering, watching her go with expressions that had shifted, almost overnight, from deference to open suspicion. In the parking lot afterward, Frank clapped me on the shoulder. "You just did in one meeting what the rest of US didn't manage in 11 years, he said. I told him it wasn't just me. It was Ruth's folder, Trent's spine, Marisol's timeline, my father's diagram. It had taken all of it. 2 days later, my lawyer received a certified letter from an attorney representing the HOA's insurance carrier, informing us that the board had voluntarily suspended the $50,000 fine, pending internal review, a legal maneuver Priya recognized instantly. "They're trying to make this go away quietly before the ethics review finishes," she said. "Quiet's not an option anymore," I told her, and she smiled for the first time in weeks. "Good," she said. "Because I don't think Deborah understands yet that suspending the fine doesn't erase the emails, or the Peterson pattern, or the inspector on her payroll. She thinks this is a retreat. It's a trap she just walked into, instead of backing off." Deborah escalated in a direction none of us expected, filing a formal defamation threat against me personally, through a private attorney unaffiliated with the HOA, claiming my public comments had caused reputational and financial harm to her outside business ventures. Priya laughed out loud when the letter arrived. She just admitted, in writing, that her HOA presidency and her outside business ventures are connected enough that criticizing one damages the other, she said, filing it away. "This letter is going straight into the fraud complaint. She's doing our work for us." The defamation threat backfired even harder once local reporter Nadia Okafor, who covered county land use disputes for the regional paper, caught wind of the standing room only HOA meeting from a tip Marisol had quietly sent her weeks earlier, and started asking pointed public records questions of her own. Nadia's first article ran under the headline Homeowners Association or Land Grab. Residents question HOA president's ties to developer, citing the Peterson sale, the inspector's employment history, and carefully, with lawyered caution, the existence of internal communications reviewed by this reporter that raised questions about coordinated fines. Deborah's response, quoted in the same article, called the allegations a coordinated campaign of harassment by a disgruntled homeowner, which Ruth read aloud to the group chat with the caption, "She means all of us." Marisol added a laughing emoji. Nobody in the neighborhood was laughing at Deborah anymore. The article did what Priya's subpoenas alone couldn't. It reached people outside our small circle, including 2 former Larkspur Hollow residents who'd sold their homes under similarly murky violation notices years earlier, both of whom contacted Nadia directly with their own stories once the piece went live. One of them, a retired schoolteacher named Vivian Cho, had been fined for an unauthorized garden structure that turned out, in her own records, to be a modest greenhouse her late husband had built decades before the current covenant even existed, grandfathered explicitly under the original 1990s HOA charter. Vivian's old lot, like the Petersons and like the one I stood to lose, had also sold to Voss and Cole within weeks of her forced move, and she agreed, cautiously, to let Priya add her case to what was quickly becoming a much larger pattern of documented harm. Priya filed the expanded fraud complaint with the state HOA oversight office that week, 3 documented cases of manufactured violations, a compromised county inspector, internal emails revealing premeditated targeting, and a media trail that made it impossible for anyone to later claim ignorance or coincidence. The oversight office, to Priya's mild surprise, moved faster than expected, opening a formal investigation within 10 days and issuing a records preservation order to the HOA, meaning nothing, not a single email or meeting minute, could legally be deleted or altered while the investigation proceeded. Deborah, for the first time since I'd known her, started looking less like a woman in control of her kingdom and more like one watching the walls of it come down brick by brick, though she still showed up to every meeting in her buttoned cardigan, chin high, refusing to concede an inch in public. She tried, at the next meeting, to push through a motion reinstating my fine, pending the outcome of external reviews. A maneuver Priya said was designed to keep financial pressure on me, even as the walls closed in around Deborah personally. The motion failed, 4-1, Trent voting last and loudest. Losing that vote seemed to be the moment something in Deborah finally snapped from calculated control into something rawer, angrier, and far less careful, the beginning, though none of us knew it yet, of the recklessness that would eventually undo her far more completely than any lawsuit could. She started showing up unannounced at my property line, standing just outside the fence with her arms crossed, watching me work on the dam repairs like she was memorizing every stone. The first time, I ignored her. The second time, I started recording it on my phone. "You think you've won something," she said one afternoon, loud enough for the video to catch clearly. "That dam is coming down whether you fight me or not." It always was. I asked her what she meant by always was. She caught herself, smiled tightly, and walked away without answering. I sent the recording straight to Priya, who called it a gift, an unguarded admission. On video, that removal of my dam had been the plan long before any legitimate violation process had even begun, undercutting every claim Deborah's attorneys had made about objective covenant enforcement. Around the same time, Sal called me with news of his own. He'd been contacted by a county drainage supervisor asking questions about the original 2009 flood engineering behind Larkspur Hollow. Part of what he suspected was a quiet internal review triggered by Nadia's reporting reaching the right desk. "They finally want to know why your dad's dam exists," Sal said. 11 years too late, but they're asking. I asked if that was good news. "It's the best news," he said. "Because once the county officially acknowledges what that outlet does, nobody can call it decorative ever again. Not even her lawyers." The county supervisor, a methodical woman named Officer Reyes Nunez, no relation, a coincidence that made us both laugh awkwardly on our first call, requested a full site visit, and I walked her through my father's original diagrams, the drainage bowl, the outlet, and the do not obstruct notation myself. She measured, photographed, and took soil samples near the spillway, saying little, until she stood at the low corner of my property, looked toward Deborah's guest wing visible through the trees, and asked quietly, "Do you know what elevation that structure sits at relative to your outlet?" I told her I didn't. A week later, Officer Reyes Nunez sent Priya a preliminary memo confirming what Sal had suspected all along. My father's dam and spillway were the primary engineered mitigation for the entire cul-de-sac's floodplain, installed after the 2009 storm specifically because the natural runoff path led directly toward the lowest lots, including Deborah's. The memo went further, noting that Deborah's guest wing addition appeared to have been constructed partially within the mapped floodplain buffer without the required hydrology review, a finding that, paired with Gary Holt's suspicious permit approval, opened an entirely separate compliance investigation the county would now have to pursue. "This is bigger than fraud now," Priya told me, practically vibrating with focus. "If the county confirms her addition violates floodplain regulations, her house isn't just built on shaky ethics. It's built on land she was never supposed to build on in the first place. That's not a fine waiting to happen." I sat with that for a long time after she said it. The idea that the exact structure Deborah had spent months trying to demolish on my land was the only thing
that had ever kept the water from reaching hers, and that removing it might finally show her, and everyone, exactly what my father had understood all along.
Deborah, apparently sensing the ground genuinely shifting beneath her, changed tactics again, this time attempting to have the entire covenant amendment that created the water feature violation retroactively ratified through an emergency homeowner vote, scheduled with barely legal minimum notice, clearly hoping to lock in her authority before the investigations concluded. Marisol spotted the notice first, buried in a mass email sent late on a Friday night, and flagged it immediately to the group chat. Priya confirmed the vote, if it passed, could complicate our position by giving Deborah's original fine a fresh, technically legitimate legal foundation to stand on. We spent the next 4 days doing something Deborah had never expected from us, organizing. Ruth and Marisol went door to door explaining the vote in plain language. Frank built a simple one-page flyer laying out the Peterson pattern. I spoke to anyone who'd listen, calmly, without theatrics, just facts. Trent, still on the board despite Deborah's obvious cold fury toward him, quietly confirmed the meeting would require a majority of registered homeowners to even reach quorum. A bar Deborah had always cleared easily in the past simply because nobody bothered to show up. This time, we made sure they would. The night of the vote, the clubhouse was fuller than I had ever seen it. Folding chairs dragged in from storage, people standing along the back wall, Nadia Okafor sitting quietly in the corner with a notepad, and Deborah at the head table looking, for the first time, genuinely uncertain of the outcome. She gave a speech about protecting property values and maintaining community standards. The same phrases she'd used on me in the garden months earlier, except now the room didn't nod along politely. A woman near the front asked bluntly, "Whose property values? Deborah? Yours? Or Voss and Cole's?" The vote failed spectacularly, not close, not contested, just an overwhelming, room-shaking no that Trent read aloud from the tally sheet while Deborah sat perfectly still, hands folded, the rehearsed smile finally, completely gone from her face for the first time since I'd known her. Afterward, in the parking lot, Ruth hugged me so tightly I nearly lost my footing, and Frank kept repeating, half in disbelief, 11 years. And it only took one pond. I told him it wasn't the pond. It was everyone finally comparing notes instead of quietly leaving one by one. Priya called that night, cautiously optimistic. The failed vote strips away her legal foundation entirely, she said. Combined with the emails, the Peterson pattern, and the floodplain finding on her own house, I think we're in a position to force a full settlement, dropped fine, formal ethics sanction, maybe even her removal from the board. I should have felt relief hearing that. Mostly, I did. But some small, cautious part of me, the part that had spent months studying my father's diagrams and understanding exactly what Deborah had tried to destroy, knew a woman who'd built her whole identity on control wouldn't simply accept losing it quietly. That instinct proved right within days. Deborah, stripped of her usual procedural weapons, began appearing at community events uninvited, cornering homeowners individually, insisting the media narrative was a smear campaign orchestrated by outside developers trying to devalue Larkspur Hollow for their own purposes, an accusation almost comically ironic given the emails. Vivian Cho, the retired schoolteacher, told me Deborah had shown up at her door personally, uninvited, asking her to reconsider her statement to Nadia, framing it as concern for Vivian's peace of mind, in a tone Vivian described as somewhere between pleading and threatening. And I've taught middle school 30 years. I know threatening. Priya sent a formal cease and desist letter to Deborah directly, warning that any further contact with witnesses in the ongoing state investigation could constitute witness tampering. A phrase that, when it reached the neighborhood group chat, made even Frank go quiet for a long moment before typing simply, "Oh, she's really doing this to herself now." Officer Reyes Nunez's floodplain investigation concluded formally that week, confirming in writing that Deborah's guest wing violated buffer zone regulations and had been approved through what the report delicately called an irregular permitting process, recommending both a county compliance order and referral to the state licensing board regarding Gary Holt. The compliance order gave Deborah 90 days to either retrofit the guest wing to meet current floodplain engineering standards, an expense Sal estimated, off the record, at well over $200,000, or demonstrate adequate alternative flood mitigation for her property, something her lot, without my father's outlet, had never actually had. I read that last detail 3 times before it fully landed. Deborah's house had never had its own flood protection. It had always, silently, unknowingly to most of the neighborhood, been protected by the very structure she'd spent 11 years and $50,000 trying to force me to tear down. Priya explained the mechanics slowly, patiently, the night I called her in something close to shock. The natural runoff path your father redirected goes straight toward the low corner of the cul-de-sac, she said.
Your dam and spillway have been quietly absorbing water.
So the dam isn't just protecting my yard, I said slowly, understanding fully for the first time. It's protecting hers, too. Without even meaning to. Without her even knowing. Priya was quiet for a moment. Which means if it ever comes down, she said carefully, she's the one with the most to lose. I didn't say anything out loud that night about what that meant, but I felt something settle deep in my chest. Not vengeance exactly, not yet, but the cold, clear understanding that everything Deborah had built her small, cruel kingdom on was about to be tested by the exact force she'd never bothered to respect. The compliance order became public record within days. And Nadia's follow-up article, HOA president's own home violates the rules she enforced on others, spread through the neighborhood faster than any group chat ever could, arriving in mailboxes and inboxes with the particular satisfaction of a chapter finally closing. Deborah did not take the compliance order quietly. She hired a second, more aggressive attorney, filed an appeal against the county, and, in a move that stunned even Priya, quietly petitioned the same overwhelmed county planning office for an emergency permit to modify my dam and spillway directly, framing it as necessary flood mitigation infrastructure repair. The petition, buried in county paperwork, claimed the original spillway was structurally degraded and posed imminent risk to downstream properties, requesting authorization to send a contractor onto my land to reinforce and reroute the outlet, a request that, if approved, would have let her legally do exactly what her illegal fine never could. Priya caught the filing almost by accident, monitoring the county portal for anything connected to Deborah's name, and immediately filed an emergency objection on my behalf, flagging the obvious conflict of interest and the fact that Deborah's own compliance order made her uniquely motivated to alter drainage in her own favor. The county, already wary after Officer Reyes-Nunez's floodplain findings, denied the emergency petition within 48 hours. But the attempt itself told us everything we needed to know. Deborah understood exactly what my father's dam was protecting, and exactly how much danger she was in without it functioning properly. That knowledge seemed to unlock something reckless in her. Frank called me late one night, his voice tight, saying he'd seen unfamiliar men walking the tree line behind my property with flashlights well after midnight, gone by the time he grabbed his phone to film, but close enough to the spillway that neither of us slept well after. I installed motion-activated cameras along the fence line the next morning, more out of unease than any concrete plan, and Priya quietly notified the sheriff's department of the pattern of harassment, requesting increased patrol attention to Larkspur Hollow, particularly around my property, given the ongoing state and county investigations. 3 nights later, the cameras caught something grainy, dark, but unmistakable. A figure moving along the spillway edge with a flashlight and what looked like a small pry bar, working at the mortar joints near the outlet gate before a dog barking somewhere down the street sent them scrambling into the tree line. Priya sent the footage straight to the sheriff's department the next morning, alongside a formal report connecting the incident to the ongoing HOA fraud investigation and Deborah's denied petition to access the same structure days earlier. The footage wasn't clear enough to identify a face, but the timing left little room for coincidence. Deputies canvassed the neighborhood, and 2 homeowners near the tree line separately reported seeing a car matching the description of one registered to Marcus Cole, of Voss and Cole Development, parked along the access road that same night, a detail that landed in the official incident report within days. Deborah, when questioned informally by a deputy as part of the canvass, denied any knowledge of the incident and expressed concern that someone might be trying to frame her business associates amid what she called an ongoing campaign of harassment against the HOA. Nobody in the report seemed to find that framing convincing. Sal came by the next weekend with a structural engineer friend of his, and together they inspected every joint of the dam and spillway, confirming the mortar had indeed been tampered with near the outlet gate. Not enough to fail immediately, but enough, the engineer said grimly, to fail badly during the next serious storm. Someone tried to sabotage it to look like natural deterioration, the engineer explained, pointing to fresh tool marks half hidden beneath disturbed moss. If this had failed during heavy rain, it would have looked like old infrastructure finally giving out. Nobody would have questioned it. It would have just looked like bad luck. I thought about Ruth's words from months earlier, you just quietly leave and everyone else moves on, and realized how easily bad luck could have swallowed this too. If not for a barking dog and a motion-activated camera, Frank's warning had convinced me to install just in time. Priya escalated everything to the district attorney's office that week, attaching the footage, the license plate report, Deborah's denied petition, and the emails from earlier discovery, framing the sabotage attempt as a direct continuation of the pattern connecting Voss and Cole to every manufactured violation in Larkspur Hollow's recent history. The DA's office, cautious as such offices tend to be, opened a preliminary inquiry rather than immediate charges. But the mere existence of a criminal file with Deborah's and Marcus Cole's names attached sent a visible shudder through the neighborhood, even those who'd never fully believed the fraud allegations before. Deborah's public composure, so carefully maintained for 11 years, finally began visibly fracturing. She stopped attending the community garden. She missed the next board meeting entirely, sending Trent a terse email citing personal matters, which Trent read aloud almost gently, like even he felt some flicker of pity beneath his relief. I didn't feel pity. Mortar joints myself. With Sal's help, working in the same slow, careful way I imagined my father once had. And when we finished, Sal put a hand on my shoulder and said quietly, he'd be proud of you for finishing what he started. Not just the wall. Marcus Cole, when reached for comment by Nadia's paper, denied any involvement in the sabotage attempt and claimed the license plate report was a case of mistaken identity. A defense that grew considerably weaker once a second neighbor came forward with a time-stamped photo of the same car parked in the same spot. Voss and Cole Development's public reputation, already dented by the earlier articles, took a sharper hit once local news picked up the sabotage story statewide, running it under headlines that paired HOA president and attempted infrastructure sabotage in the same sentence. Language no development company wanted anywhere near its name. Two of the company's other pending projects, unrelated to Larkspur Hollow, stalled abruptly as county officials in neighboring jurisdictions quietly requested additional review of permits connected to Marcus Cole's name. A ripple effect Priya said was entirely predictable once fraud allegations reached a public courtroom filing. Deborah, isolated now even from some of her longtime allies on the board, made one final, desperate procedural move attempting to call a snap vote to remove Trent from the board entirely, citing conduct unbecoming, a transparent effort to silence the one insider who'd consistently refused to fall in line with her. The motion failed before it even reached a full vote, blocked by a quorum objection from 3 separate board members who, sensing which way the wind had finally turned, seemed suddenly eager to distance themselves from Deborah as completely and publicly as possible before the investigation swallowed them too. I watched all of this unfold with a strange, exhausted clarity, not triumph exactly, but the specific relief of watching a structure built entirely on intimidation finally buckle under its own weight. The same way, I thought, floodwater eventually finds every hidden crack in a wall built without honesty at its foundation. Priya warned me, gently but firmly, not to mistake Deborah's unraveling for surrender. "Cornered people don't get safer," she said. "They get more dangerous. Right up until the moment they finally have nothing left to lose. Keep the cameras running. Keep documenting everything. We're close, but we're not done." That warning proved prophetic within the week. A county drainage crew, sent to formally survey the outlet as part of the ongoing floodplain investigation, arrived to find someone had already contacted them independently, claiming to be me, requesting the dam's voluntary removal be scheduled immediately, a request I had never made. Priya traced the call back through the county scheduling system to a burner number, untraceable to any registered account. But the timing, 3 days before an unusually strong storm system was forecast to move through the region, struck Sal as far too precise to be coincidence. If that dam comes down right before a major storm, with no proper drainage plan in place, it's not just your yard that floods, Sal said grimly, pulling up the Weather Service's rainfall projections on his laptop. It's the whole low corner of the cul-de-sac, including hers. I understood, then, with a cold clarity that settled over me like the first chill before a storm, that someone Deborah, desperate and cornered, or Marcus Cole, protecting his failing investment, had tried to engineer my own compliance into becoming the very disaster they'd once tried to sabotage me into causing. Priya immediately filed an emergency motion with the county to formally block any unauthorized removal request tied to the fraudulent call. And Officer Reyes Núñez, already deeply familiar with the case, personally flagged the scheduling attempt as evidence of continued interference in an active investigation. The storm arrived 2 days later anyway, heavier than forecast, and I spent the night watching rain hammer the oaks behind my house. My father's spillway doing exactly what he'd built it to do 15 years earlier, channeling the surge safely past the cul-de-sac's low corner, past my house, past hers. In the gray light of the next morning, I walked the property line and found the dam intact, the pond swollen but controlled, water moving exactly along the path my father had engineered, while 2 streets over, according to Marisol's group chat updates, a different low-lying yard near the community entrance had flooded ankle-deep by dawn. Deborah's yard, for now, stayed dry, protected, still, by the very structure she'd spent nearly a year trying to destroy, and I felt something complicated settle in my chest watching the water recede safely past her fence line. A feeling I didn't yet have a name for. Priya called that afternoon with news that shifted everything again. The district attorney's office, spurred by the sabotage attempt, the burner number scheduling call, and mounting public pressure from Nadia's continued reporting, had upgraded its preliminary inquiry into a formal criminal investigation naming both Deborah Voss and Marcus Cole. "This changes the legal landscape completely," Priya explained. "Once criminal charges are formally filed, the civil fraud complaint and the county compliance order both move faster, because no judge wants to look like they let a documented pattern of fraud and sabotage slide while waiting on a slower parallel track." Deborah, served with a criminal investigation notice at her own front door, according to a neighbor who witnessed it, did not appear at the next board meeting, nor the one after, and Trent, now functioning as de facto board president, announced her indefinite suspension from all HOA duties pending the outcome of both investigations. The clubhouse, when I attended that meeting, felt different in a way I struggled to articulate at first. Lighter, somehow, the folding chairs still arranged, in their familiar horseshoe, but without the low hum of quiet fear that had colored every meeting I'd attended since the beige envelope first arrived. Ruth squeezed my hand as the meeting opened. Frank gave me a small nod from across the room, and Marisol leaned over to whisper that Vivian Cho had decided to attend too, sitting near the front for the first time since she'd sold her house years ago. Watching with something like cautious hope, Trent formally proposed rescinding the unauthorized water feature covenant amendment entirely, citing both the failed ratification vote and the county's own findings about the outlet's true engineering purpose. And this time the motion passed unanimously, with even the two board members who'd once rubber-stamped Deborah's every decision voting yes. I should have felt purely victorious hearing that vote read aloud. Mostly, I did. But some quiet, watchful part of me, the part shaped by months of studying my father's diagrams, of understanding exactly what that outlet protected and who knew the story wasn't finished yet, not while the criminal investigation still hung open and unresolved. That instinct sharpened into certainty 3 days later, when Sal called with news from his contact at the county drainage office. Marcus Cole had quietly filed an emergency request of his own, seeking authorization to install a temporary secondary containment barrier on Deborah's property, in anticipation of possible structural changes upstream. Structural changes upstream, Sal repeated, disgust evident in his voice. That's them. In writing, planning for your dam to come down, one way or another, and trying to protect her house before it happens. They're not giving up. And getting ready for the flood they still think they can control. Priya flagged the filing immediately as further evidence for the criminal investigation. A company executive preparing defensive infrastructure for a specific property based on
inside knowledge of a planned or anticipated failure elsewhere. Language that, in her words, reads less like precaution and more like a confession nobody meant to file publicly.
The county, now thoroughly entangled in the scope of the case, denied Marcus Cole's containment request as well, citing the active investigation and the impossibility of authorizing anticipatory defensive infrastructure tied to a structure under criminal scrutiny, a ruling that left Deborah's floodplain violating guest wing exactly as exposed as it had been all along. I drove past her house one evening around that time, unable to resist the pull of curiosity, and saw the guest wing sitting dark and empty, a for sale sign not yet planted but a moving truck idling in the driveway. Boxes visible through the windows even though the compliance order's 90-day window hadn't yet closed. Ruth, when I mentioned it at the next informal gathering, said simply, "She's not fixing it. She's running." Marisol nodded slowly. "Running from a flood that hasn't even happened yet," she said. "Because she knows, better than anyone in this neighborhood, exactly what that dam was always protecting her from." The criminal investigation moved through its early stages with the particular slowness of institutions unaccustomed to moving quickly. But Priya assured me each subpoena, each deposition, each records request was narrowing the case toward something concrete, even as the waiting itself became its own quiet, grinding kind of stress. I threw myself into finishing the dam's restoration properly during those weeks, replacing every stone Sal and his engineer friend flagged as compromised, reinforcing the spillway gate with materials my father would have approved of, treating the work less like repair and more like a promise I intended to keep completely. Trent, now leading the board through its own painful reckoning, initiated an independent audit of every fine issued over the past 11 years. And the early findings, leaked in fragments through the group chat, painted a picture even darker than we'd suspected. Dozens of families, not just 5, quietly pressured out over the years. Vivian Cho started a small, informal support group for former residents once word spread, meeting monthly at the library 2 towns over, comparing notices, timelines, and sale dates, slowly reconstructing a decade of Deborah's quiet campaign, one displaced family at a time, each story adding weight to Priya's growing case file. Nadia's reporting expanded into a 3-part investigative series. The final installment focused entirely on the human cost: the schoolteacher who lost her husband's greenhouse, the young family who'd sold under duress 2 years before I moved in, the elderly couple who'd simply stopped fighting and disappeared from the neighborhood entirely. Reading those stories, I understood something about my own fight I hadn't fully grasped before. I hadn't just been protecting my father's dam, or even my own house. I'd accidentally become the first person in 11 years with both the reason and the resources to refuse to quietly disappear. Trent's audit results were formally presented at a packed board meeting, confirming a documented pattern across 22 properties over 11 years, each find under vague or retroactively altered covenant clauses, each eventually sold at a discount, a striking number of them landing, directly or through shell entities, with Voss and Cole Development.